Welcome everybody to CryptoBeast 20. I'm Steve Outtrim. Today we're going to be talking about the Grateful Dead. Picking up from where we left off last episode, number 19, we had Chip Wood on with Robert Forte and Joe Atwill, and Chip told us the story of how he created the idea for the Grateful Dead as a way to stop global thermonuclear war. And he was at Fountain Valley High School in Colorado with Bob Weir and John Perry Barlow. He said that using hypnosis techniques that he'd picked up from his father's connections to the CIA and working on a plan that had been approved from the Kennedy White House, his dad was an advisor to Kennedy, they were going to use the music of the Grateful Dead to unite the youth of the world and steer them away from desiring to fight nuclear war, steer them towards seeing peace as a desirable outcome. And I think for people who are new to my channel and new to some of these ideas, they might have thought, what the hell is this guy talking about, the Grateful Dead being a government psychological operation? That's outrageous. But some of the people that have been with me from the time I got on YouTube, if not before, and sharing in my research on Facebook discussion groups and stuff, these ideas are pretty old. I mean, we're picking up on the essay by Joe Atwill and Jan Irvin, Manufacturing the Deadhead, a Product of Social Engineering. It was written in 2013. Dave McGowan's work, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, looking at the USAF Lookout Mountain Laboratory on top of Laurel Canyon, that seems to have been instrumental in drawing together all of these young people from military families and Masonic families to create the music scene and the counterculture of the 1960s. So there was very much a project afoot to create a counterculture, and the Grateful Dead was indeed a large part of that project. And there's circumstantial evidence of that, and there's also what you would call direct evidence of that. And you know, a lot of people, I think, weren't buying Chip's story. I personally would love to have him back on to hear some more and to ask him some questions. We've had some good questions come in from the audience since the last episode. But what I want to do as perhaps a spacer before that is, you know, to share with you my own research so far on what I've found looking into the Grateful Dead and their ties to, you know, the Counterculture Project and the MK Ultra Project were kind of both the same thing, both coming out of Stanford University in particular, and even a certain area of Stanford called Camp Fremont that we'll talk about today. So I'm going to try a little bit of a different format for this show, and I'm basically going to go through my Brain database. This is software, you can get it for free from thebrain.com. I use the paid version. It's a fantastic piece of software and I highly recommend it. A great way to store your thoughts and to organize your research. So if this works out, then I'll probably be able to do this again for other topics. I mean, if you've seen my previous series, Silicon Valley's Secret Weapon, The Shadow History of Burners, that was an 8-part, well, 7 parts, but part 5 has 2 parts, so technically an 8-part series over nearly 24 hours, looking at the links between Silicon Valley, the military intelligence complex, counterculture, social engineering, and Burning Man. If you're not familiar with that series, you don't have to watch the whole thing. You can probably watch episode 7 and episode 1, whether you're interested in Burning Man or not. And in fact, the first 3 or 4 episodes of that series really aren't touching on Burning Man too much at all. But I'd recommend, if you only wanted to see a few of them, as well as 1 and 7, part 5B, I think, has a lot of very interesting information that's come from my research of attending Burning Man since 1998, being a part of Silicon Valley since 1995, and also growing up in a military family and always having an interest in, you know, both the military world and the world of parapolitics, which is the idea that the government isn't the top of the pyramid in our society, that governments actually are put in by, you know, those who are really in power. And the two-party system is really a uniparty system that's been spread around the whole world with extensive use of secret societies. And, you know, to really understand what's going on today, we need to look back through the lens of the past, back, you know, 200-300 years in particular. So many massive things have gone on in the world, and that's what I've been really looking into in my research, with a particular focus on what's behind the scenes of the technology industry. That's what I call shadow history, and the Grateful Dead actually has an enormous amount of overlap with the technology industry. So for the too long didn't read crowd, let me just summarise. You've got Bear Owsley, sound engineer, created the LSD, basically the band's first manager, organised, put it all together and financed it and provided the drugs. He came out of the Air Force. Tom Constantine came out of the Air Force. Jerry Garcia, Army. Stuart Brand, Army. Ken Babbs from the Merry Pranksters, he came out of the Marine Corps. He's actually a highly decorated helicopter pilot in Vietnam before the Vietnam War. Hank Harrison, one of the early people involved in managing the Warlocks, the Dead, and part of the scene. He said the Grateful Dead all came from Masonic families. He's a Freemason himself. Courtney Love's father believes she's responsible for Kurt Cobain's death. And he's part of the Bohemian Club. In fact, he dedicated one early edition of his book about the Grateful Dead to the boys from the Bohemian Club. John Perry Barlow, working with the CIA and NSA, that's by his own admission. He said in Forbes magazine he was recruited into the CIA by Robert David Steele. And he said in an interview with Julian Assange in the Ecuador embassy on RT that he personally knew all of the top people of the NSA and they're all good people. So he's someone who made no secret of his ties to the deep state and also came from a very strong political family and Masonic family. His grandfather laid the cornerstone for Sublette County, the county building there. Alan Trist, early manager of the Dead, founder of Tavistock. Ken Kesey, he was participating in the MK Ultra project. Mickey Hart came out of the Air Force. He's a member of the Bohemian Club. Bob Weir's a member of the Bohemian Club. Jerry's girlfriend, when they started the Warlocks, Bridget Meyer, her mother was working for the Stanford Research Institute, a major defense contractor, and she'd worked previously for the RAND Corporation. Bill Kreutzmann, his father was a soldier. He had a law degree from Stanford and then he went on to become a soldier, then worked for Lockheed Martin. He was told to become a drummer at age 12 by Aldous Huxley. So there we have again this group, someone being recruited into it and perhaps groomed for a later career from a very, very young age. I believe it's Kreutzmann also. Bill Kreutzmann's grandfather, Clark Shaughnessy, is a very famous figure in the world of football, and he was actually the coach of Stanford, but he was also the coach of a team called the Maryland Terrapins, and Terrapin would later become a big word in the Grateful Dead scene, but he's quite a significant person. Bill Kreutzmann's grandfather, Clark Shaughnessy, he was also a very famous footballer. He was the coach at Stanford, and he was also the coach of a team called the Maryland Terrapins. Maryland, of course, being home of the NSA and various other agencies, and Terrapin became an important word in the Grateful Dead scene. It's still a club today, I think owned by Phil Lesh in Marin County. Brent Midland, his dad was a chaplain in the Army. Phil Lesh, he tried out for the 6th Army Band at the Presidio. They didn't think that he was really the Army type. He seemed to be a little bit of a long-haired musician, and they didn't think he would cut it with the discipline of the Army. So instead, he ended up meeting Jerry Garcia, another guy with the exact same disposition of the Army who got a security clearance from the Presidio, and they formed the Grateful Dead. Alembic, who made the amplifiers and equipment for the Grateful Dead for Owsley's Wall of Sound. That was a company that was set up right next to Hamilton Air Force Base in Marin County. The buildings were adjacent to the runway, and the amplifiers they were using actually came straight out of military technology that the Navy was using them to simulate the sounds of Russian submarines underwater. So, that acoustic technology developed for the Navy by Alembic went on to also become the wall of sound technology for the Grateful Dead. And Ampex, that made the tapes for the Grateful Dead, Myron Stolaroff, from there, he was part of the MK Ultra project, and they are a major defense contractor. And this is probably as good a time as any to throw in with the Grateful Dead. A couple of things there. Their logo with the skull that Chip says he came up with the design of. that happens to be a recognised symbol for Nazism and white power. Also, here's the logo for the 312th Military Intelligence Battalion, and you can see they have the red and the blue and the lightning bolt just the same. So, seems to be a little bit of reminiscent of military intelligence. I'd like to point you to, if you haven't seen it, a special show we did on the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love, which was in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. It's called 50 Years of Flower Power. And I did that with Joe Atwill, Hans Utter, and Jan Irvin. And we looked really into the evolution of the Summer of Love and how this was basically designed, and particularly by the group headed by Stuart Brand. And we're going to be talking about him a bit more today as well. So the Grateful Dead is I know it's a touchy subject for many Deadheads and passionate fans. And for myself, I grew up in New Zealand and I'd never heard of the Grateful Dead. And I think they did tour Australia a couple of times, but it wasn't really until I started spending a lot of time in San Francisco that I became familiar with them. And actually living in Marin County, I had many friends who were very tight with people in the Grateful Dead and working for them, including John Perry Barlow, who I was lucky enough to meet a few times and have some great conversations with. And everyone that I've ever met in that Deadhead scene has been nothing but extremely nice to me, and I only really have nice things to say about them. And talking about the fact that they all seem to be connected to the military and the military industrial complex and Silicon Valley projects being run out of Stanford, I don't consider that as saying anything bad about them. I think it's quite an extraordinary project that happened. And, the consequence of it, so many people's minds destroyed by these psychedelic drugs and suggestogens, these rock idols leading so many people astray and away from truly the core of life and the core of love, the family unit and the personal connection with a God of universal love. That seems to be kind of where the world was before the 60s came along. And then this free love, the pill, social engineering, hippies, turn on, tune in, drop out, all this stuff was very, very carefully designed by social engineers such as Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary.
Well, I'll say one of the goals was to make the American people smarter, raise their intelligence. And I think the American people today are quantum jumps more sophisticated in exactly the general directions in which we all hope they would become more sophisticated, about consciousness, about the nervous system, about the brain, about the options people have in creating their own reality, about self-actualization, self-indulgence, about pleasure being a self-reward as opposed to high reward. My God. Pleasure is now the #1 industry in this country. Recreational travel, entertainment, sensory indulgence. My God, it's now, no question that's our #1. Now, that was my goal.
And, I'm not going to go too much into those guys on this show. I've talked about them before, and we'll probably delve into some of the other aspects of that again. But what I really want to get into is, what are the secret society military intelligence connections of the Grateful Dead? And I don't mean to cause any offense to any Deadheads with anything in this. Please comment if I get anything wrong. Because I didn't grow up being into the music, I don't have that encyclopedic knowledge of what went on in the Dead scene, but I have, as an outsider, I think, studied it pretty hard, and I've come up with a surprising number of connections between these people and the military intelligence complex. And maybe we'll begin with Jerry Garcia. And so I filed a FOIA request on Jerry Garcia as military record, and I believe that I am the first person to do so and to discover that he had a secret security clearance. So, 115 pages. It's pretty detailed FOIA request. A lot of the ones from the military haven't had so much information. His mother's last name, Matushewicz. Just noting that for the record. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I'll just point out some things of interest. This is saying that he is voluntarily enlisted for a period of 3 years. And then after active duty, he transfers to Army Reserve to complete his 6-year service obligation. Then he becomes a member of the Ready Reserve, and he will be required to continually participate in training with a reserve unit or as a member of a control group. Now, one of the things that we showed in Berner's series is that the military intelligence psychological operations group running out of the Presidio had extensive use of reserves, who are people with day jobs but are also part of these military intelligence units. So that gives the unit itself the ability to completely penetrate society. And that's what I believe this record shows, and past history shows happened with Jerry Garcia, that he wasn't suitable for the Army. He got a secret security clearance. They moved him out and they put him into a project where, working out of Palo Alto, and a group of social engineers clustered at Perry Lane around Stanford University, and people like Robert Hunter and Ken Kesey, who are in the CIA's MKUltra program, they would create this operation to create a band. So I believe I'm the first person to be publishing this information. And it does contain his social security number. He's been dead a very long time, so I'm sure that's okay. This is a government document, supplied under a Freedom of Information Act request. But the reason that I didn't block it out just in case is I really want to point out to you guys that Jerry Garcia had 666 in his social security number. Isn't that an interesting coincidence amongst the universe? So anyway, it says here the highest classification of the security clearance out of top secret, confidential, or cryptologic is secret. So Jerry Garcia had the second highest level of security clearance from the 17th of October 1960. So he basically joined the Army and pretty quickly was sent to the 30th Artillery Group at Fort Winfield, Scott, California, and subject to a national agency check, and it was conducted by the headquarters of the 6th U.S. Army, that's the Presidio, San Francisco. So Garcia, he got kicked out of the military. He wasn't suitable for service, and then he shows up in this military-industrial complex-connected band. His security clearance being secret, there is no information that was ever rescinded, so certainly that would have been a suitable asset for him to bring into this next project. Now, did every single person working in the 30th Artillery Group Air Defense have to have a secret clearance? I don't know, quite possibly. I'm not claiming any knowledge of that either way, but certainly I think that it's notable. Here we have recommendation for elimination from the service. So 2 months after they gave him the secret security clearance, they're like, okay, let's get him out of here. And I think that's of interest because some of the other members of the Grateful Dead also did much shorter stints in the military than they would normally be required to. So I'll be pointing that out as we go through them. But this says, I recommend that Garcia, a member of this battery, be eliminated from the military service prior to his scheduled termination of enlistment by reason of character and behavior disorders. So he's getting kicked out for behavior disorders. I mean, does that really happen that often in the military? It says he doesn't hold a reserve commission in this one. Garcia has steadfastly maintained a defective attitude towards superiors, authority, and military life in general. His personal appearance, personal cleanliness, and personal billeting area in the barracks, although minutely improved upon through constant supervision and instruction, have been and are currently much below the standards prescribed and maintained in this unit. In spite of repeated counselling by his superiors, Garcia has made no effort to soldier, perform, or meet the standards expected of a soldier in any manner. So he didn't want to be there, and they kicked him out. I think that says pretty clearly. So let's talk about what's the rest of the stuff we know about Jerry Garcia. Jerry Garcia was given his nickname Captain Trips. That's another military reference again, Captain, at a party at the Big Beat. And this was a club that was right opposite Lockheed Martin, which has major presence in Silicon Valley, probably the biggest employer in Silicon Valley, and particularly back in those days, we're talking 19 65, I believe, is when the acid test happened. And the weekend before this club opened, so first of all, they wanted to open a club across the road from Lockheed Martin, targeting the people that work there. That's the target audience of the Grateful Dead. But also, this is the second public acid test. So, yeah, officially in the history of the Grateful Dead, I think this is considered the third acid test, with the first one being an experiment taking place at Ken Babbs's house in Santa Cruz. Also of interest, he enlists in the army when he was 17. This is from the McLaughlins, who've done also fantastic research into the Grateful Dead and Scientology in general, and there's a lot of overlap between this band and Scientology as well, which they've identified as, you know, another project of the intelligence community, another cult involved in mind control and all kinds of experimentation, with many ties to the intelligence community and an interest in social engineering. But they've done some great work on the Grateful Dead, and they've noticed that here's a red flag. When Jerry comes out of the army, he goes straight to Palo Alto. And they've said here an unlikely army stint where he had 2 courts-martial and 8 AWOLs. So from the military record, I can't really justify that these were 2 courts-martial. He does seem to have been disciplined by the army, which I think is a little bit different from a court-martial, but we might perhaps splitting hairs there. Here's Jerry Garcia in his own words, being interviewed by the East Bay Times. For a long time I dragged my feet over total commitment to the Grateful Dead, he said in an interview in 1989. For a while, I thought the Grateful Dead might be a CIA plot. For a long time, I vacillated. So he thought that it might be. Okay, you know, that's fairly significant. Well, I think that it might be as well, and, you know, it's more than just Jerry's suspicions that we're going on at this point. How many of the people connected to this band, you know, were involved with the military or with secret societies? So you've got Bear Owsley, you know, making all the LSD for it, buying the sound equipment, designing this wall of sound system that was a huge part of the Grateful Dead experience, and basically being the band's perhaps first manager and producer. You know, he came out of the Air Force, and he did a much briefer stint than usual in the Air Force. Tom Constantine came out of the Air Force. Jerry Garcia, Army. Stuart Brand, Army. He was one of the Merry Pranksters, and he was the Army's top photographer, and he was also a parachutist. So he went on to do some interesting photography and art projects connected to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is Mommy's Museum, according to Nelson Rockefeller. In 1953, the Sandoz patents on the LSD formula expired, and that meant that Eli Lilly could get involved in producing it. 1953, Humphrey Osmond meets Al Hubbard, also known as Captain Trips, ironically enough, through mutual friend Aldous Huxley. And Al Hubbard ended up working at the Stanford Research Institute directly for Willis Harman as a special agent.
That was about 1960, 61. When you went to Harvard?
Back at Harvard, 1961, maybe.
When he came to visit Harvard, was that the first time he did?
Yeah, that's the first time I'm back.
60.
They gave me years ago. They said, depends on whether you can't high or can't low. I gave him 100, a tablet of 500, a bottle of 500 tablets.
I remember that.
I mean, the scope of the story is just so vast, and it branches off in so many different directions. I'm going to try my best to keep it focused today to the Grateful Dead. You've got the Order of the Trapezoid, begun 1955, of course, next to the Presidio, San Francisco, which you see pictured behind my brain database there. Fantastic aerial shot of the city. That dark triangle of green area in the middle of San Francisco is the Presidio. That's the oldest military base in the United States, and there was a terrible satanic ritual abuse, child abuse scandal there at the daycare center, and the base was closed in the 1990s. And basically, when it shut down, the 7th Psychological Operations Division that was based there moved down to where the Googleplex is located in Silicon Valley now, and the entire modern internet and Silicon Valley of today sprang up and was launched from that location. So that's what I talk about in one of my Shadow History series. Coming back to the Grateful Dead timeline here, where we've got this guy Myron Stolaroff, and he starts doing these LSD therapy sessions with Willis Harman and Al Hubbard. So this is a very interesting character because he is associated with Ampex. So Myron Stolaroff, born in Roswell, New Mexico, master's degree in electrical engineering from Stanford. Then Ampex Corporation, 1946 to 1960. In 1960, he founded the International Foundation for Advanced Study in Menlo Park. So just like with the Lookout Mountain Laboratory operated by the US Air Force with larger studio space than all the Hollywood studios combined at the time, doing top secret missions on top of Laurel Canyon, and all of a sudden all these musicians emerge in Laurel Canyon. Here we have someone out of the Ampex Corporation who made tape. Now, we can think of tape, I'm 46, I remember a tape recorder and a Walkman. And, kids today are probably not really familiar with tapes. Maybe they've seen a cassette tape. But if you go back to the 1960s, magnetic tape was an incredibly new, innovative invention, and it was enormously important for this emerging new world of computers. So who was using tape was really the military and the space program and spies, secret recording devices, satellites. They all needed to record their information. Even like rocket testing, they needed to record telemetry data in the rockets and aircraft during testing. That's what tape was used for. So Ampex was supplying the military-industrial complex, and Stolaroff for sure would have had a high-level security clearance. So here he is coming out of this spooky sort of company, and Ampex is also very tied to the San Francisco Tape Music Center, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well. But this people are doing research into LSD, which he is, I'm sure, being supplied by Al Hubbard, Captain Tripp, since we've got him freely admitting that he supplied the LSD to Timothy Leary at Harvard. So he I'm sure, was supplying the same stuff to these guys, and they were enlisting, the top members of the big defense contracting companies to get involved with this substance and do the first tests. And then all of a sudden, you've got guys like Jerry Garcia, Robert Hunter, Ken Kesey, Phil Lesh, all getting together and creating, the Grateful Dead, along with Alan Trist, whose father, was the founder of the Tavistock Institute. So we've got Alan Trist, and here he is remembering, I'd just come over from Paris. Before I came to California, I spent a few months hanging out on the left bank. So there's an interesting congregation of many of these revolutionary types and the Beat generation in Paris right at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. And that's a bit beyond the scope of today's show, but maybe we'll look into that another time. But he's hanging out in the left bank. He's going to Shakespeare and Company bookstore. He went from there to Kepler's, a famous bookstore associated, with the 60s revolution. And it seemed to me to be two parts of the same thing. I'd been studying the symbolist poets in Paris, Mallarmé and Rimbaud and Verlaine, as well as Henry Miller, Nexus Plexus, books that were banned in other countries. I also was living right next door to the Beat Hotel, near Place de Saint-Michel, which was a place where Corso and various other Beats stayed when they came to Paris. The Beats were like half a generation older than us, and they would allow us younger denizens of the left bank to come up to their pot dens by the Seine for a glimpse of the tradition. So from that experience, I came straight over to Palo Alto, and I immediately saw the connection. So we're supposed to think that this is a coincidence that he came from the Beat Hotel in Paris to the Beat scene, Perry Lane and Stanford, where some of the Beats such as Allen Ginsberg and Neil Cassidy are there hanging out as part of the crew, forming the Merry Pranksters, forming the scene of the Grateful Dead. And this guy's dad is the founder of the Tavistock Institute, Eric Trist. He volunteered and joined the Tavistock group in the army. He wanted to be with the Tavistock people. He was very involved. Hugh Murray's social engagement of social science. His first job was devising a psychological test program with intelligence tests like the thematic apperception tests and a life history questionnaire. My son Alan was born in Edinburgh, and we were then transferred to J.P. Morgan's country house near London, and the family came back to London, right? So here we're getting into the absolute core of the origins of this, and I've mentioned many times before about Brigadier General Sir John Rawlings Rees. He created the Tavistock Institute plan post World War II to rule the world with 5,000 psychiatric shock troops, and that by controlling the state of mental health of the world and basically saying people who didn't toe the line were crazy or insane or labeling with the system and then giving them the right to medicate them and make that thing become true. I mean, this stuff was the theme of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? Ken Kesey's novel, which, you know, won him all kinds of awards and became an Oscar-winning movie starring Jack Nicholson, remember? This was an iconic novel of the 1960s, and it came out of a guy in the MKUltra program, which we now know was a CIA program with 149 sub-projects going on at 85 universities and a total of at least 170 institutions around the world, not just even in the United States, right? So this is a worldwide project of mind control, mass mind control, you know, coming out of studies in World War II and even before that, of mass observation, the ideas of 1984 and Brave New World. You know, it's science fiction novels of a dystopia, but you look at Aldous Huxley and his brother Julian Huxley, the founders of UNESCO, the Huxley family, and their involvement in so many of these social engineering projects that, you know, that wasn't just a book. This is something that's been going on, and the reason that it seems real today is because this was a carefully calculated plan. You know, that people like J.P. Morgan are inviting the world's top psychologists to live in their freaking mansion. Come and live with your kid in my mansion, and we will implement this plan to control the world through psychiatric shock troops. So that's what's going on, and this guy who's doing it in the mansion is going to Stanford for some reason at the time this project comes together, and his son becomes, you know, friends with Garcia and hanging out, and considered by some a first unofficial manager of the Grateful Dead. In 1961, Alan was on a year holiday. He was going to be attending Cambridge University later on in the fall, so a gap year as they call it. Of all the places in the world to bring his son, this is from the McLaughlin research that I'm reading, Eric brought him to Palo Alto just in time for Willis Harman's LSD MKUltra student experimentations to be gearing up to get off the ground. I mean, here we go. Here's a hell of a coincidence that just as the CIA is getting these MKUltra experiments off the ground, the head of the Tavistock Institute comes to Stanford, and he's hanging out at Stanford at Perry Lane, and so's Allen Ginsberg, and so's Neil Cassidy, and so's Jerry Garcia, and the rest of them. I mean, it's one hell of a coincidence. So let's coming back to this timeline. Timothy Leary and Dick Alpert fired from Harvard, 1963, and 1963 is, if you remember Chip's story, that's when he said at the end of the school year, he sent Bob Weir off to Palo Alto to join this mission. And the mission to put together a band as a psychological operation, Chip says he came up with that idea, suggested it to his dad and also to Uncle Ed Lansdale, and through the family's connections to the intelligence community and the things that were discussed around their dinner table, the word got back to him that this idea he had as a 16-year-old boy, address global thermonuclear war with the idea for a band that was a psychological operation, it got the blessing of the White House and got approved, and so they were putting the band together. So this project, we have 1960 was the time frame when Jerry Garcia joined the army, got a secret security clearance, got kicked out of the army ostensibly, and then was, you know, ended up in Palo Alto connecting with these people. And then he had this infamous car crash, 1961, where a 16-year-old kid died in the car crash. And so again, we've got young, mid-teens getting involved with these people where there's a large amount of drugs going on in the scene. March to May 1961, Robert Hunter meets Jerry Garcia at the Commedia dell'arte Theatre in Palo Alto. And this is 1961 is when Mary Meyer begins visiting JFK in the White House and supplying LSD to him. And that's one thing that if Chip does come back on the show, I definitely would like to hear more from him about that relationship. He knew the people involved personally. Then we have Kennedy's assassination was 11/22/63. That's also the day that Aldous Huxley died. We believe injected with LSD by Laura Archera in collaboration with Sidney Cohen. And his head was removed and cryogenically frozen, which, if you remember, that Timothy Leary was also planning to do that, but he changed his mind and instead turned his body into ashes, some of which were sent into space and some of which were taken to Burning Man by Susan Sarandon, who led a LSD-fueled ritual procession to a temple they had constructed for Leary's ashes, which they then burned down.
This is a ceremony, a very minimal ceremony for Timothy Leary's ashes, which are in here, and which you all very generously have agreed to walk with us to the Totem of Confessions, where we're going to lead him, and he'll be there until it burns. He'll be double crispy on Saturday.
Recremated on Saturday.
Recremated on Saturday. So thank you all for coming. For anyone who doesn't know who Timothy Leary is and you've taken acid, you should be ashamed of yourself. Everyone who's joined in the sacrament tonight, I'm really happy to hear there's a lot of you, and he'd be so happy to know that this is going on here. I got his ashes. Timothy Leary, for those of you who don't know, was the leader of the whole thing to take LSD away from the CIA and make it a means of exploration for everybody. And he suffered at times for doing that. I mean, legally he suffered and was in prison for a while. And he's called the father of this movement. And he was a very happy, loved women, loved all the conversation that was going on, that was beginning with the internet and everything, had an enormous amount of faith in the future and in youth, loved touring colleges for that reason and here, and he would be so excited all the time. And the bulk of his ashes were jettisoned into space at his request, and then he left a tiny bit, just a little hors d'oeuvre portion for a few people, and I was lucky enough to be one of those people. And so I've been thinking what to do with these ashes all this time, because he was a prophet, really. And first time I went to Burning Man, I thought, well, they should live here.
It also came out that Timothy Leary was an FBI informer, and he actually wrote the entrance exam for the CIA, which was known as the Leary. So I didn't turn up very much from FOIA into Timothy Leary's military records, but he was in the army, that's confirmed. I should also mention Alex Allen. He is a world expert on the Grateful Dead. Here he is pictured with his buddies in their Grateful Dead cycling attire. And here he is with a Grateful Dead windsurfer and a bowler hat on, windsurfing down the Thames outside the Houses of Parliament. And he is the top, or was the top spy in Britain, appointed by Gordon Brown to be the new British spy master and also a world authority on the Grateful Dead. He's the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, which is the apex of the British government spy network. So the top spy in the United Kingdom is also a world expert on the Grateful Dead. Now, that could just be an amazing coincidence, but if the Grateful Dead were an intelligence community connected psychological operation, then that's the sort of thing that actually would probably make a lot of sense, right? That someone connected to the operation who'd studied it from the 60s and the enormous influence that it had on, controlling people all the way up to Secretary of State John Kerry having the photos on the wall of his office, Judges go to Grateful Dead concerts, generals go to them. So all around the world, the impact of the PSYOP was so significant that the British spy chief just happens to be an expert in it. Not only that, but Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, as a student at Oxford, Mr. Blair was the lead singer in a rock group called Ugly Rumours. And Mr. Allen reminded him that the name was taken from the cover of From the Mars Hotel, a Grateful Dead album. Mr. Blair was so impressed with Mr. Allen's website that in 1999 he asked him to be the government's e-envoy, responsible for dragging the civil service into the age of the internet. Okay, so the top spy chief also brought Britain and the government onto the internet in the age of the internet, and he's an expert on the Grateful Dead, windsurfing down the Thames, Grateful Dead windsurfer. I'd also like to show you the FBI vault, what they have to say about the Grateful Dead. Woodstock, town of Bethel, that was obviously under the observation of the FBI already at that point. Black Panthers, heavily redacted. We don't know who told us we don't know what. They requested that someone call her back with a number at which she could contact the Grateful Dead. Something to do with the Black Panther FBI investigation, their Operation Huey Newton, head of the Panthers, and that connects to the Grateful Dead. So they were involved with these type of underground operations, as well as the manufacture of LSD, which, as an intelligence operation, would make more sense that they're doing that, the FBI is watching them and they keep doing it, than if they're just civilians. Like, surely if the FBI is getting this level of intelligence from them, the 1970s, they're able to do something about it, but obviously they were prevented from that. This is the U.S. Servicemen's Fund, Inc., Support Our Soldiers Summer of Support, SOS, the Shelter Half GI Movement Center, Tacoma, Washington. So I guess the Grateful Dead doing a military benefit concert, that's how I interpret that. The Shelter Half is a coffee house catering to military personnel at McCord Air Force Base in Fort Lewis, Washington. It's moved to Tacoma, Washington, with a 1-year lease. So supporting the troops, good for them. This extremely heavily redacted, so think about that. Something's going on that not only was the FBI spying on the Grateful Dead about it nearly 50 years ago, but this is so secret, whatever it was this thing is, that not a word of it can be shared to the public in the FBI vault in responses to FOIA requests. So what does this mean? Who knows? But it does mean that there's something secret going on that, it would be great to get to the bottom of it. And look, Grateful Dead, spelt incorrectly, but they are appearing on this list. And that's the same SE 100 29275 number on both those documents. So whatever this is a list of, they're on it. Internal security, the new left. That's interesting. That's, I guess, what they're being associated with. And remember Timothy Leary saying that the liberal CIA is the best mafia that you can deal with. Kansas City Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs Unit, organised crime. DEA specifically requested FBI assistance for technical and surveillance coverage. Allegedly purchases large quantities of LSD from Block residing in San Francisco. Presumably that would be Bear Owsley, but it could be Tim Scully, Nick Sands, manufacturing LSD in San Francisco as well. What's the date of it? 84, so by then, maybe even William Leonard Picard. LSD originates from San Francisco, California, through a renowned rock group known as Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead is well known to DEA San Francisco. So there you go. They're well known to the DEA and the FBI. That's where LSD originates from. Now, we know now with the benefit of hindsight that LSD originates from the CIA's MKUltra program. And so here we have an FBI document saying that the DEA knows that the LSD originates from the Grateful Dead. So you put 2 and 2 together and you've got the Grateful Dead being part of the CIA's MKUltra project. And one of the main characters of MKUltra, Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist who was in the Macy conferences and, helped put the CIA together with their particular focus on anthropology, he's there at the foundation of this story at Perry Lane with Eric Triss, the founder of Tavistock, right? 1960, 1959, 1960. Myron Stolaroff with all the tapes for all the recording devices that they're going to put in Operation Midnight Climax and all the other experimentation, right? It was all being recorded on tape. That's what they had back then, right? And, those tapes, do they still exist? We heard a lot of documentation related to the MKUltra project was destroyed, but what about all of that research? All of those recordings, are they still out there somewhere? Here's a document. This is out of the CIA archive, and it's Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, a massive military defense contractor, software development company that does all kinds of other stuff as well. And a 1991 PhD study, Anomalous Cognition in Lucid Dreams. So this is like in the CIA vault. The CIA is obviously very interested into this research into lucid dreaming. Summary of Maimonides' results on tendency for dreams to be judged more like target than non-targets in target pool. So they are basically testing people with monitoring devices to measure their dreams during the night, and they see what happens if they're getting sensory bombardment and how that affects the dreams, or what happens if they're being played the Grateful Dead. So, there is some evidence of the Grateful Dead being involved in CIA experiments. Here's a clip from Alembic. You can hear them in their own words telling you the story of how they were using the same equipment as the Navy, and there were demands on the equipment from the military. And this is an organisation set up next to Hamilton Air Force Base.
Rosie was one of the first people I became friends with at Alembic, which was the first place I worked at when I came here. And Rosie was like, you did everything.
Yeah, a little bit of everything.
Quick anecdote, and you might not remember this, but maybe you will. We were using Macintosh amplifiers, vacuum tube amplifiers, and I found out subsequently what the military was doing with them was putting them on submarines to drive these like speakers that were out in the water miles away to emulate Russian submarines. So our attack submarines could chase this signal. And I remember we were ordering these amplifiers for Jack and Phil. The PA was okay. And do you remember the military calling and asking if we would defer an order so that they could get more Macintosh 3500s? I remember you coming out of your desk and saying, wow, the Army or somebody from the Army just called us. Things were interesting back then.
Yeah.
The amplifiers were also being used to drive cable that led to a submersible remote-controlled baby submarine, and they were using the Ampex equipment to record, to play back the sounds of Russian submarines as well. So this is two of the suppliers of the Grateful Dead. Ampex, that's supplying the tapes for they're quite classic for all the underground taping of Dead concerts that happened, and Alembic, that's supplying the amplifiers. Alexander Poniatov founded Ampex in 1944, primarily to manufacture small motors and generators for military applications. When World War II ended, the military contracts dropped off, had to search for a new line of business. They heard a magnetophone, a German magnetic tape recorder used by Hitler during World War II, convinced them to redirect the company, and in a short time they dominated magnetic tape recorder market in radio, television, record industry, industrial and military markets for instrumentation recorders. And you have Ron Wickersham that started Alembic. He actually was out of Ampex, so he had that defense contracting background to go on and create this. Very involved in creating the Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound. The Navy has used Mac amps forever. They use them to power active sonar transducers on diesel submarines and early nuclear ones. The amps are relatively impervious to EMP interference from radiation, so this is weaponized technology. That's this is military grade stuff that's being used to put the Grateful Dead together and to entrance people while they're on the psychedelic drugs with a wall of sound. The amps would power the sonar beamformer output that was then rendered into a visual display format so we could see sound and drive the ship accordingly. One of my sonar techs was a huge gearhead, would patch our cassettes into the beamformer and watch music. So, you bet they're down there playing the Grateful Dead to these whales and stuff when in between Russian submarine noise testing. They shared a fence with Hamilton Air Force Base, so that makes it quite easy to get the amps in and out from the military. 12/31/1963 is when Bob Weir meets Jerry Garcia, and they agree to form a band. So that aspect of the timeline does check out with Chip's story. Weir left Fountain Valley and went and joined the band, but Garcia had been in Palo Alto hanging out with this scene and the music scene down there for about 3 years at that time. 1964, we've got Project MK Search to try to develop a capability to manipulate human behavior through the use of mind-altering drugs. And we've heard from Chip that the intention of the psychological operation was to manipulate the behavior with the messages of the music, which were sort of deliberately like vague and non-political. They would evoke emotions and feelings, but it would be these hippie emotions of peace and love and wellness and well-being and kindness, rather than like, you know, what later we would call heavy metal and gangster rap and stuff like that, where the music has been weaponized to incite people towards more violent behavior. So, you know, whether you believe his story or not, you can definitely see that element of the music of the time, that it was very peacefully oriented. And, you know, people were marching in the streets in these days. They were protesting the Vietnam War. But this time, 1963, this is before the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident was August 1964. October 64, Mary Meyer is shot dead. The murder was never solved. And then November 64, Johnson, he beats Goldwater in an election. Process Church of Final Judgment breaks off from the Church of Scientology in 1965. It's a splinter group from Scientology. And then 1965 is also when Bear Stanley first synthesizes crystalline LSD, and he begins distribution of the Owsley Acid March 65. There's a march for Vietnam Day in the streets of Oakland. 10,000 people, November 1965. The Beatles releases the album Rubber Soul, which is considered the pot album. Revolver was the acid album, according to John Lennon. And then, okay, December 1965, acid test organizer Ken Kesey enlists the Warlocks as the house band for his acid tests. This is the Grateful Dead, formerly the Warlocks. Then we have December 4th, 1965, the San Jose acid test. That's basically the first public Grateful Dead show. 1966, Owsley builds a LSD lab in Point Richmond, California. January 21st, 1966, the 8th acid test is the Trips Festival, which is put on by Stuart Brand at Longshoremen's Hall. That goes for a few days, and they get about 10,000 people coming in, and people are just overwhelmed at how popular this hippie culture and acid culture has become. There are so many people around the San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley that want to get involved in this countercultural revolution being pushed by Stuart Brand. Then we have May 1966, Anton LaVey starting the Church of Satan, which, if you can see, my mouse is just over here, right to the right-hand edge, which is actually the southern edge of the Presidio. The right hand of this photo is where Anton LaVey got started, and then the bottom of the photo here is Baker Beach, where Burning Man got started. So they're both on this sort of the edge of this V-shaped section, the tip of the spear of the Presidio. Church of Satan and Burning Man, two things with a lot of military intelligence ties and the same underlying ideology and philosophy. Then we have October 24th, 1966 is when possession of LSD is banned federally in the US. And at that time, Owsley leaves the Grateful Dead in his sound man position, so it's been driven underground. January the 1st, 1967, the CIA's Operation Chaos begins. January the 14th, the Human Be-In in Golden Gate Park. And then June the 2nd, 1967, the American release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles, full of Freemasonic symbolism with Aleister Crowley on the cover. And John Perry Barlow brings this record and the Grateful Dead to Millbrook, Timothy Leary's Millbrook. John Perry Barlow shows up with a copy of Sgt. Pepper's and the Grateful Dead to the gatehouse to the Millbrook mansion, the estate that's owned by the Mellon family, Billy Mellon Hitchcock. There he is pictured with Timothy Leary doing yoga or something like that. He's working with Johann Paravicini, the House of Paravicini being a black nobility banking family. And these guys basically seem to be running the entire drug trade of the 60s. This, you know, the banking here links to this guy, Robert Vesco, who's involved in all kinds of CIA banking scams. You know, he's connected to Carlos Later, And Carlos Slater, of course, is tied to Pablo Escobar and the drug trafficking coming through Miami. So over here in this Millbrook mansion, Leary, who's been kicked out of Harvard, is basically having all of these, like, you know, young, good-looking teenagers like John Perry Barlow dropping by the property to stay and take tons of acid and other kinds of drugs, while everyone's, you know, running around naked practicing yoga and free love. And guess who is the gatekeeper that opens the door and lets Barlow and the Grateful Dead straight on in to the event? Michael Allen Weiner, better known as Michael Savage, a very popular radio and talk show host these days. Yep, he was the gatekeeper at Timothy Leary's acid house, and supposedly was hired by Leary because he didn't use LSD himself. And then his son, Russell Weiner, went on to found Rockstar Energy Drink. You know, he's become a multi-billionaire. So, you know, nothing to see here, move along. But the Mellon family were meeting frequently with Richard Helms, the CIA director. So, anyway, coming back to the timeline of the Grateful Dead, you know, we're talking about the band getting together and becoming the Warlocks, 1965, and then also becoming the Grateful Dead in 1965. 1961, Tom Constantine, ex-USAF, he's in Berkeley. He hooks up with Phil Lesh. They share a room. Constantine's a Scientologist. They became roommates and enrolled in a graduate-level course taught by Barlow at Mills College in Oakland. Now, I've actually been to the Mills College Music Center and looked through their archives, and before Phil Lesh was there, John Cage was there, and John Cage associated with the Black Mountain Group. If you look into the work of Stanford professor Fred Turner, who's traced, you know, from counterculture to cyberculture, and the connections of the Stuart Brand Group working out of Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, Stanford Research Institute, to all these counterculture people. It's not just a few of us internet cranks coming up with this theory. This is someone from the Center for Advanced Studies of Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, a professor there who was given complete access to Stuart Brand's papers in the Stanford archives. You know, wrote an outstanding book outlining all of this stuff as well. And I really do, if you're interested in the stuff, I recommend Fred Turner's book, and he's also got some video lectures about it, and he shares his thoughts on Burning Man as well. So I'll leave some links to that in the description for this video. But, you know, John Cage was a very powerful figure in this kind of transforming the world through art and avant-garde kind of art. So he left a big stamp at Mills College, and then Barlow was also, Luciano Barlow, a very famous composer, and he created one of the very first music festivals that happened, that sort of set the precedent for these Summer of Love type festivals that were launched later, which was the Ojai Music Festival in 1947, founded in 1947. And this is connected to Christopher Isherwood, who I believe was a lover of Aldous Huxley, and was when Huxley was living in Beechwood Canyon in Hollywood. But basically, the genesis of Hollywood was a theosophical colony called the Crotona Estate, and Aldous Huxley, Jared Hurd, and Chris Isherwood were all living together in this area at one time. And then the Ojai Music Festival, becoming the first music festival, is noteworthy to me because there was this Crotona colony when it became just a bit too famous and popular and well known what they were trying to get up to in secret in the burgeoning Hollywood society. The Crotona colony relocated to Ojai, and so you have Hollywood coming out of this colony, and then you also have music festivals coming out of this theosophical colony. And I also would point people to Miles Mathis's work from Theosophy to the Beats. I think it's just called beat.pdf on his website, and you know, he really traces how the occult got packaged up into poetry and then later song and rock and roll and delivered to people, you know, with this message of tune in, turn on, drop out, while you're being bombarded with psychological operations, mind control, and hallucinogenic, suggestogen drugs, being, you know, given the ideas of how to dress and how to think and speak and what your values should be from these rock idols, and these rock idols on a stage with their messages being amplified electronically, guarding or congregating the population into groups, segmenting the population off into groups, and then each group can then be controlled simply by controlling the rock idols. And when you look up to who most of those rock idols were in the 60s, but also as you know, today we've got 50 years now looking back on this operation when what happened, they all seem to have been very consumed by sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They're told that's how to behave, and you know, these are all the tools of the devil and of black magic, very easily used to compromise, to seduce people, and to lead them along a path away from the family unit and love and community and goodness and wholesomeness. You know, that's really what I think was the target of this operation, because those values are of no use to the military intelligence complex. Honest people are much, you know, harder to turn to your advantage, and good people who don't descend into the pits of depravity are harder to compromise into blackmail. And so therefore, what did the intelligence community need? They needed to promote degradation and depravity, and they needed ways, underground ways, where people could easily be caught in criminal behavior and therefore compromised. And even if they didn't use drugs, the drugs could still be planted on them by the police. That's one side effect of the war on drugs and the criminalisation of drugs. And as these bans were launched, the criminalisation of drugs was launched at the same time as well. And so if you accept that the ban was a system of population control and social engineering being created by the State Department and the intelligence community, you know, to avoid thermonuclear war or whatever, you also have to accept that the drugs that were being brought in by these intelligence agencies in many cases and, you know, distributed wherever the Grateful Dead went, every kid for 100 miles knew that they'd be able to go there to score acid. That's how it worked. That was the scene, the psychedelic culture that they promoted. And likewise with Burning Man, I think most people realise that if you go to Burning Man, it probably won't be too hard for you to find some sort of drugs, and everything is free at Burning Man. And today the rave scene as well is the similar type of thing they're promoting. You know, everyone knows, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that at some massive rave of 50,000 people, they're all off their heads on ecstasy or whatever. And yet somehow this keeps going on. It's tolerated. And not only that, when you look at the early history of the rave scene, you see a lot of it taking place on military bases, airfields and things like that, government facilities, and likewise with the Grateful Dead. So 1964, we've got Ken Kesey, bus trip to New York. One prankster didn't make it and landed in the loony bin. So we'll go into that a little bit later, the story of these pranksters getting this bus and putting it together. You've got 1965, Ken Kesey has a Hells Angels party on September 6, 1965, was the first newspaper story by Michael Fallon that used the word hippie to refer to the younger Bohemians as opposed to the older Beat generation in San Francisco. The name did not catch on with the establishment press until almost 2 years later. And then October 2, 65, Beatles concert at the Cow Palace. It was so bad the pranksters had to leave halfway through, and that was basically the end of the Beatles as well. You know, the Beatles' last gig was in San Francisco. And as the Beatles went away, what do you know? Basically straight away pops up the Grateful Dead. And the first acid test is November 27th, 1965 at Ken Babs's place. December 4th, 65, the second acid test at Big Nigs, where the Grateful Dead played as the Warlocks. And already they had 400 people at that. The San Francisco Mime Troupe, December 9th. The third acid test at the Big Beat, opposite Lockheed Martin, is December the 10th. The fourth acid test, December the 17th, and Owsley freaks out. And then there's a fifth acid test in Portland, Oregon, December 24th, 1965. So there we've got this band, the Warlocks. So they formed early 65. So the Grateful Dead didn't exist until 1965. How did the Warlocks become the Grateful Dead? So let's take a look at this, how the Warlocks became the Grateful Dead. Well, formed early in 1965, the key experience, the most profound building block of the band's early days, was the first acid test. The whole world just went kablooey, Garcia said, recalling his first experiences with the drug. My little attempt at having a straight life was really a fiction. So, I mean, that sounds like a lifetime actor right there. So, between the second acid test on December the 4th and the third on the 11th, the Warlocks agreed to perform a benefit concert for the San Francisco Mime Troupe. They were on the bill with Jefferson Airplane, the Great Society, John Handy Quintet, the Mystery Trend, and the Gentleman's Band. Bill Graham wanted to hold this at a bigger venue because there was buzz going around already, so he secured the use of the Fillmore, and that's like a whole story in itself. I'll put you to our 50 Years of Flower Power special for some stuff that, you know, sharing my research on Bill Graham, but that, you know, that is something we should maybe come back to with him at one point as well. So here we go, the Fillmore, which became instrumental in the launching of this entire music scene to San Francisco and the world. But they found out there's already an established band called the Warlocks. So when they were playing at the Big Beat opposite San Francisco, there would be one band on each side of the acid test, one called the Witches and one called the Warlocks. But apparently there was a different band that was called the Warlocks. And so at this time they had to change the name, and Garcia suggested the Grateful Dead. It was a truly weird moment. Bill Graham didn't like the name. It gave him the creeps. And then Lesh said, I'm sorry, it's the decision we've made. Here's what you do. Put formally the Warlocks in the space where the picture would go. This would be the first in a long series of clashes between Graham and the Dead for many years to come. The poster, the dates that I read out of the last thing from the timeline of this event happening between the second and third acid test, that looks like it's not correct, because this is saying Fillmore, Friday, January the 14th, San Francisco Mime Troupe. But all those bands that I mentioned are there, and here we go, the Grateful Dead, formerly the Warlocks. So this is January 14th, 1966, and Chip Wood is saying that he gave the concept, the name, and the concept of the Grateful Dead to Bob Weir in 1963, and then Weir hooked up with Garcia Christmas Eve in Palo Alto, 1963. So the name wouldn't be used for another 2 years after that. So this early Grateful Dead Merry Prankster scene, it was very much centered around Palo Alto. Carolyn Mountain Girl Garcia says, Palo Alto was the magic carpet. It was where everything happened. That's where the music was. Jerry was there, and Hunter was there. All the characters were there. Palo Alto was the beautiful golden basket that this all came out of. Palo Alto was incredible in those days. And, you know, Palo Alto is still a pretty happening place today. Garcia's met Phil Lesh and keyboardist Pigpen McKernan at Palo Alto parties. Garcia and Robert Hunter lived side by side in their cars in a nearby parking lot in Palo Alto. The Warlocks rented instruments from Swain's House of Music at 451 University. Who paid for that? I'd be interested to know. When he encountered Bob Weir, Garcia had a job as a guitar and banjo teacher at Dana Morgan Music on Bryant Street. He was basically free-floating and freeloading until his life was jolted by a terrific car crash on the night of February 20th, 1961. At around 1 in the morning, after a party at the Chateau, Garcia went out for a drive with three friends, Alan Trist, Paul Spiegel, and Lee Adams, who was behind the wheel of a 1956 Studebaker Golden Hawk. The car was up nearly 90 miles an hour on Junipero Serra Boulevard when it jumped the guardrail, flipped over several times, and landed on top of Spiegel, killing him instantly. All the passengers were thrown from the car, including Garcia, who literally came out of his shoes. The three survivors ended up at Stanford Hospital, with Garcia sporting a broken collarbone. Later he would say that crash was where my life began. Before then I was always living at less than capacity. I was idling. That was the slingshot for the rest of my life. So some of the hallmarks of the sort of satanic sacrifice that we see with many people connected to this, you know, massive success in rock and roll. Like, for example, Lady Gaga, one of her friends, tragically died right at the start of Gaga's career, and some say that Lady Gaga then adopted her image and perhaps even musical style and took that on. It's again beyond the scope of this discussion. By early 1964, Garcia began his move towards forming the Grateful Dead. On New Year's Eve 1963, Garcia had met 15-year-old Bob Weir, future Grateful Dead guitarist, who later described the fortuitous encounter. I was wandering the back streets of Palo Alto with a friend when we heard banjo music coming from the back of a music store. It was Garcia waiting for his pupils, unmindful it was New Year's Eve. We sat down and started jamming and had a great old rave. I had my guitar with me and we played a little and decided to start a jug band. And that's called Mother McCree's Uptown Jug Champions, and they're playing folk music, banjos, jugs, and bluegrass. A long way from trying to stop thermonuclear war at this point. The story of the chateau is very interesting, so let's take a look at this place, 2100 Santa Cruz Avenue. And Jerry Garcia moved in there in October 1961, and Robert Hunter was already living there. And this place, it just said, my notes on it say, all these 16-year-olds just keep showing up with booze, being welcomed in, dying in car crashes. No one cares. Jerry wakes up on the lawn. He doesn't know what's happened to him. They tell him he was in a car crash and fill him in on the details of it all. So that's the thing that catapulted him forward in his life, this strange event. He actually had no recollection of it, and the Veterans Hospital that he woke up on, the lawn there, that's where the MKUltra experiments were being conducted. So yeah, nothing to see here. Move along. So Lee Adams, who was in the car crash, he was the house manager of the chateau. He's the driver. And then Paul Spiegel was a 16-year-old artist and acquaintance of Garcia. And remember that Garcia was barely a teen himself at this time. He was probably 18. So what sort of place is this? You know, it's Santa Cruz Avenue is near Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park, which is now the epicenter of the entire tech industry. That's where all the venture capitalists' headquarters are located. So Sand Hill Road is where they create Google and Facebook and Amazon and everything like that. And that's part of the Camp Fremont military section of Stanford as well. So it's home to various members of the scene. Jerry was always the leader of the scene. It's a three-story house with lots of rooms, and one of the first hippie group living together situations, loud, wild parties, lots of people drunk, sometimes out of hand. And, you know, Pigpen started showing up at the chateau when he's around 16 as well. So you're seeing this pattern here. Look at these 16-year-old kids come to this house where we have drugs and booze and everything like that, you know, and really cool music. A tape made at the chateau during a party dipped the Groovy Conclave includes Garcia performing Matty Groove's The Mournful Murder Ballad, The Long Black Veil, and Hoyt Axton and Ken Ramsey's Greenback Dollar, a chart hit for the Kingston Trio in 1963. Among the other groovers are Phil Lesh and Tom Constantine. So recording tape in 1963 was not recording tape in 1993, right? Like, how did they get the tape? They've got access to this most advanced stuff coming out of Ampex, the tape company, and we know that Myron Stolaroff in Ampex is participating in LSD experiments as part of the MKUltra program, along with Willis Harmon from the Stanford Research Institute. So these things are all connected together. This is from Dennis McNally's book, A Long Strange Trip, The Inside History of the Grateful Dead, which is, I consider, the definitive book on the Dead. It certainly taught me a great deal about what happened there. Excellent read. And he's talking about the chateau. So discharged from the army in January 61, Garcia's moved to East Palo Alto, the African-American side of Palo Alto. His friend since junior high, Laird Grant, was staying and sleeping on couches and garages, donated beds. The car becomes his apartment. So he's a teenage indigent, I guess. He gets taken under the wing of a guy called Dave McQueen, a black man, neighbour and friend of Laird Grant's. They hustled odd jobs together, the Laurel and Hardy of East Palo Alto. And then McQueen hears Garcia play the blues. He's never heard a white man with soul like that. He says, "Come on, I'm going to take you around," and starts taking him to the Palo Alto party circles, which include a bunch of guys who live on the other side of Palo Alto near the Stanford University campus at a rooming house called the Chateau. The chateau sheltered a bizarre collection of young black and white bohemian proto-artists, musicians and weirdos, and parties there more closely resembled a Fellini film than a campus sock hop. A visit in 1961 typically included being greeted by the non-resident Joe Novakovich, a lunatic vagabond known to wear a hangman's noose for a necktie, who happened to be missing half his fingers, like Jerry was missing a finger, remember? And consequently insisted on shaking hands with everyone. Or one might meet John Page Browning, who'd just left the US Marine Corps equipped with a bullwhip and a double set of fast draw handguns. Right, so you've got armed Marines present at this Fellini-like festivities. So McNally's saying here that Paul Spiegel was 15 when he quit high school 3 years before, so he was 18 at the time of this car accident. So a slight difference in the story. Next to him is Alan Trist. His dad is on sabbatical at Stanford Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences, which is one of the institutes of advanced study modeled on the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study set up just before World War II, that we can trace things like the War of the Worlds, Princeton Radio Project, psychological operations coming from, famously testing how they can scare and control the public using this new technology of radio, and also so the development of some of the first computers with Howard Aiken, John von Neumann and Vannevar Bush. It says here, just before leaving the chateau, Spiegel and Trist had been acting out what Trist later called death charades. Paul in his dramatic black cloak fencing with Alan, who was using a fireplace poker for a sword. The driver was the chateau house manager, Lee Adams, a smooth-talking black man. So this is a bit weird, right? That they're acting out these death charades, they're playing with a sword, there's all these teenagers going to this Fellini-like party where all the drugs are and armed Marines are, and then somebody ends up dead, and Jerry Garcia ends up on the lawn of the VA hospital with no idea what happened. I want to read you one more story about the chateau. This is from Palo Alto History. Interestingly deleted from the internet, but available from archive.org. As a 15-year-old kid, I was invited up to the chateau by my friend Roger Coolbreeze Williams. So there you have again another teenager coming into this thing. As a non-initiate, I was beyond my realm when I passed a lanky, bearded individual on the front porch who, with abandoned eyes like black saucers, was using a long, folding pearl-handle fruit knife to clean his fingernails. Cleaning his fingernails with a knife. When we went inside, Garcia was sitting at the dining room table in an agitated state and frustrated because he's having difficulty finding a certain chord on his guitar. A couple of people jumped on him as he fell back in his chair, knocking over a gallon bottle of Red Mountain, pocket knife in hand, and professing he was going to cut off a finger to make his hand more adaptable to the guitar. This ruckus did not interrupt the semi-nude threesome in the sitting room, who were swaying and in a state I only came to understand years later. Breeze went on to notoriety in the opening chapter of Tom Wolfe's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which is another excellent account of this time and this scene. And, Stuart Brand featuring heavily in that book as well. But, here's a story that there's naked people and threesomes going on where these 15-year-old kids are being invited round to these drug parties, and nobody thinks anything of that. So as well as the chateau in this early prankster and warlock scene, we got to go to this place called Perry Lane. It's on the Stanford campus. So the cottages at Perry Lane were originally built for the military when they took over Stanford during World War I for the Army Camp Fremont. And this is really the place where it all began, where Ken Kesey put together the Merry Pranksters. And you had all kinds of characters living in the houses down here, including Allen Ginsberg, who we know is a pedophile member of NAMBLA. Here's a clip of him at the 50 Years of Flower Power with a young child that's pretty disturbing.
But if the parents are here for this child, please come and take him.
And here's Ginsberg actually giving a speech at NAMBLA about how much he loves little boys.
This is the poet Allen Ginsberg. Sweet boy, in your ass. Let me kiss your face, lick your neck, touch your lips, tongue and tickle tongue and nose to nose, quiet touching. I was never known before.
You have Neil Cassidy. I'll come back to him in a second and his connections to that whole world of teenage boys and stuff. Dorothy Fadiman, her husband James Fadiman was one of the MK Ultra doctors connected to the International Foundation for Advanced Study, where Myron Stolaroff, Willis Harman, and Al Hubbard are doing their MK Ultra research. The Stanford Human Augmentation Research Center. So they're looking into the uses of drugs to augment humans. He's also connected to Xerox PARC. He's the main person pushing microdosing at the moment, being funded by the Hefter Research Institute, and he's friends with Jim Channon. So 3 people have passed away since I started publishing my research, all a similar age. Jim Channon, John Perry Barlow, and Larry Harvey. And Jim Channon, he calls himself a social architect and highly praised Burning Man as a great example of social architecture.
I'm Jim Channon. Call myself a social architect. One of the things social architects do is they design spaces so that people can have a bigger sense of life force, actually an experience. There is data, then information, then knowledge, then wisdom, then experience, then maybe rapture, where we're looking at the highly charged experience you can get when you bring a group of people together in full play, with music, with color, with motion.
He created the First Earth Battalion, which seems to be the military prototype model for what the socially engineered archetype, the burner, became today. Going back to Perry Lane, you've got other people there like Paul DeCarli. He's from the Stanford Research Institute, the first to synthesize diamond. So that's the type of dudes who are hanging there where Ken Kesey is basically bringing home drugs from the Veterans Hospital that he is getting as part of the MK Ultra project, and then he's cooking up things like venison chili, putting the drugs inside them, dosing everyone, and then orgies are breaking out. And here's a guy who's worked for SRI for most of his career on government contracts involving large-scale shock experiments and material properties. You have Gene Farmer. He's a TV producer, came out with Sanford and Son, Chico and the Man, That's My Mama, and the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, so more social engineering coming out of there. Lee Anderson, who was the drum teacher for Bill Kreutzmann. He had a degree in physics from Stanford, and the government wanted him to make nuclear weapons. So, there is a connection there to the thermonuclear war that Chip is talking about. Larry McMurtry, who is an extremely famous author of, he's the guy who wrote Brokeback Mountain. Lonesome Dove is possibly his most famous book. The Terms of Endearment, The Last Picture Show. So Ken Kesey, a very highly accoladed and acclaimed author. Larry McMurtry, even bigger author than that, and that they're all there at the same time on this Wallace Stegner Creative Writing Fellowship, living in these military houses in Perry Lane. Now, one thing I haven't been able to identify, and if anyone in the audience has any information to shed light on this, I would love it, but is there any relationship between Larry McMurtry and Grady Louis McMurtry? Grady McMurtry was basically the head of the OTO. He died in 1985, and basically a guy called William Breeze became the head of the OTO after that, who's from the band Coil. So in my Burner series, I did look at some of the early origins of Burning Man, tying into that sort of industrial goth metal, hardcore gay and BDSM scene in the mid-80s in San Francisco. And it was interesting that when the OTO changed hands to a new breed, when this guy died, that's when Burning Man started. That's when the internet was launched. That's when the Cacophony Society was launched, and that's when MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, that was launched at the same time as well. So let's take a look at Camp Fremont, which is the military part of Stanford. Soon after the US entered World War I, April 1917, they began planning for war mobilization on an unprecedented scale. And nationwide, there were going to be 32 cantonments to train a vastly enlarged army in new techniques such as trench warfare that they'd need on the Western Front. One of them, Camp Fremont, was located in part on Stanford land, was leased by the government, and adjacent landowners occupied 25,000 acres, including today's Dish Hill, SLAC, the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center National Accelerator Laboratory, and much of the city of Menlo Park. Few traces of Camp Fremont exist today. One feature that does exist, at least vestigially, is its elaborate mock battlefield created with gun ranges and underground passengers on nearly 1,000 acres of Stanford land so that soldiers could rehearse with copious live ammunition the trench battles that were a defining feature of World War I. So 25,000 acres of the Stanford campus, which is basically all of Silicon Valley, is the Stanford land. 25,000 acres of that the military took over in 1917 and put 1,000 acres of underground tunnels through this land. Now, part of this land was Perry Lane. So just zooming in on this map, there's a whole bunch of areas that are marked non-available, and there's at the top here it says engineer something. Overlaying that to the previous map that we saw of Perry Lane, and down the bottom here it says division headquarters non-available. I'm thinking that this area sort of towards the top right that's the Perry Lane area. That's what it turned out to be later. So this is considered the Bohemian Quarter of Stanford. One argument for Stanford teaming up with the military in this way was that it was the patriotic thing to do to support the war effort, but the university was in financial trouble. They had an endowment of about $20 million. That was mostly tied up in ranching land. It wasn't easily converted into liquid cash. And so basically the money for this deal was brokered by San Francisco's mayor, P-H-E-L-A-N, Phelan, or maybe Phelan, quite a famous mayor in San Francisco, and I believe Stuart Brand is actually married to a Phelan. Stanford illustrated the war's laissez-faire financing. The new president, Ray Lyman Wilbur, was an ardent advocate of U.S. military intervention. So the previous guy before him, David Starr Jordan, who took over when Jane Stanford died, was murdered, she announced to the press, and then died of poisoning in Hawaii. And David Starr Jordan, a Rockefeller eugenics type of guy, took over, but he was anti-war. So he was replaced with Wilbur, who was very pro-war. Wilbur wrote, "It now seems clear that if we're to be part of the future, we must take a man's part in the present." So Stanford is absolutely a place where the future comes from today. I mean, more than any other university I could think of in the world. And this is really the origins of that military money starting to pour into the university and creating what is Silicon Valley today. By October 16, Stanford trustees had earmarked a large lot in funds for a pistol range. Students voted 590 to 217 for compulsory military training. Stanford's academic council voted to mandate a 3-hour weekly drill for men. So they're gearing up for the draft. 98 faculty members signed a telegram to Woodrow Wilson urging intervention. So they wanted America to get into the war, and they wanted to be supplying, trained men for this war effort. So when Senator James D. Phelan, I guess he'd gone on from mayor at that point, he was dismayed to learn that his home region was not among the discussed sites. The criteria were proximity to railroads, warm climate. The government wanted to save money on barracks by putting as many soldiers as possible in tents. So here's the early precursor of Burning Man, is stick them in tents at Stanford. And if possible, terrain similar to that of the Western Front. So Phelan telephoned San Francisco Mayor James Rolfe, who rushed to the Presidio the next day, secured Western Department Commander Major General Hunter Liggett's blessing to submit any possible locations for a camp. After brief looks at Contra Costa County and Millbrae, the government accepted the following offer. San Francisco will procure a 1-year lease rent-free, 25,000 acres of land in the vicinity of Palo Alto to be used by the War Department for Army training purposes to train approximately 1 division of troops. Also agrees to cause a suitable water supply to be piped from the limits of the cantonment and to deliver sufficient gas and electrical and ample sewage lines. So the military is taking care of all of that stuff going into these 25,000 acres, the land that the whole Perry Lane complex is on, where you've got these SRI, military contractor working on, top secret explosives testing for the government, hanging out with Ken Kesey and Babs and the Merry Pranksters and Stuart Brand, wiring up recording devices, and Bear Owsley cooking up the acid. Well, actually, the Owsley came later. That was more like 65. So Stanford officials seem to have given little thought to how 28,000 soldiers could be brought alongside a mixed-gender campus with the propriety that the age demanded. So there's all kinds of scandals going on with Stanford girls having to mix with these, rough and ready soldier types instead of being, go to one of the most elite colleges in the world. Even back in those days, it was very highly regarded, and things were a bit more prim and proper back then than they are in 2019. They were going to run 3 discounted fare trains a week from Camp Fremont to San Francisco, which is where all the whorehouses were. So that was their solution to keep these soldiers away from the Stanford girls. And I mean, interesting that sexual dynamic is there, given what then happened later at Perry Lane. In many ways, Camp Fremont brought the larger world in all its complexity to Stanford's doorstep and augured the university's growing role in national and global affairs. So by the time we get to 1960 and Ken Kesey moving into Perry Lane, that's been well established as the Bohemian Quarter of the university, sort of anything goes type of place. And 1959, you have the commencement of these MK Ultra experiments. Dr. Leo Hollister is the one down at the Veterans Hospital in Menlo Park, and he has come out of the Navy. He's working directly there with Gregory Bateson, and Gregory Bateson ties completely back to the Macy conferences in cybernetics and mind control, an anthropologist who worked with the CIA, married to Margaret Mead, another anthropologist who studied the sexual mores of Samoans, and basically used that as an anthropological basis for the free love of the 60s, to go in conjunction with Aldous Huxley coining the phrase "the pill," promoting this new birth control pharmaceutical, which is one step on the way to the total medicated society of the brave new world. So let's take a look at Ken Kesey, because he was really the leader of this pack, the front man for this operation. He says himself, "I came out of the University of Oregon the prettiest little boy you've ever seen. I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I went to Stanford on a Ford Foundation fellowship." Now, that's his words, and it's kind of interesting because you can go and get the list of Ford Foundation fellows. And he doesn't appear in this list, which is kind of a little bit interesting. He was going to be in the US Olympic wrestling team, and instead of that, he chose to go to Stanford on this Wallace Stegner creative writing fellowship, and to become part of, volunteer for even the CIA's MK Ultra program, drug experiments. And so he was a psychiatric aide in this hospital as well as volunteering for the experiments, and then he wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest based on those experiences. So that's a book about MK Ultra that became instantly a hit book. And let me read you this quick excerpt from his writing from that book, which is basically the model for the hog farm and Woodstock, the complete drug-fueled, sexually tinged, nudity-fueled debasement that was rolling around in the mud off your face on the acid of Woodstock, right? And the same energy being brought to mud rituals at Burning Man. You can look those up on YouTube. Anyway, he says, as part of his training, a psychiatric aide must spend at least 2 weeks working the geriatric wards, or shit pits, as they're called by the other aides. These wards are concrete barns built not for attempted cures or even attempted treatments of the herds of terminal humanity that would otherwise be roaming the streets, pissing and drooling and disgusting the healthy citizenry, but for nothing more than shelter and sustenance, waiting rooms where old guys spend 10, 20, sometimes 30 years waiting for their particular opening in the earth. At 8 in the morning, they're herded and wheeled into showers, then to day rooms where they're fed a toothless goo, then are plunked into sofas ripe with decades of daily malfunctions of worn-out sphincters, then fed again, washed again, and their temperatures taken. If they're still warm enough to register, their impacted bowels dug free in the case of their sphincters worn out in the other direction. Their hair and cheesy old fingernails clipping swept into a little pink and grey pile and fed again and washed again, then usually left alone through the long afternoons. So you can kind of see how that's a social engineering model for the couch potato society that we live in today, but it's kind of hard to see how this is like breakthrough literary writing from the Stanford, fellowship program to me. It sounds really like Tavistock programming, like we've seen so many times before. Kesey once said, "I'm a programmer now, I'm a computer programmer." So he thought of himself as programming people with this stuff. This excerpt says Kesey became an academic champion as well as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow at Stanford. So we have he himself later saying that he's a Ford Foundation scholar, fellowship, which I couldn't verify, but he does seem to have had this Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. Also the Wallace Stegner Fellowship. So why did Kesey say Ford Foundation when it was Woodrow Wilson? I mean, if you'd received this fellowship that was the breakthrough thing that enabled your career to, write a best-selling author and a movie made of your book with Jack Nicholson that gets Oscars, and, you become the toast of the town and can buy this Dayglow bus and drive around the whole country with, microphones and recording devices all through it, dosing people with LSD, how could you get that wrong? But the Ford Foundation, of course, is widely considered to be a CIA front, obviously very closely connected to it, and the social engineering goals and agenda. And I'm sure the Woodrow Wilson Center at Stanford University is also like that, as is the whole university. But that's a case of getting your CIA fronts mixed up, which only someone who had spent their entire life, immersed in these things would do. The detail, I think, wasn't important to him, because his career has been working with these groups in this situation, starting from Stanford in 1960. Kesey's connected to the Human Potential Movement, which was obviously very tightly tied to the Esalen Institute as well. And then, from there you get to Jim Channon and, his version of the First Earth Battalion, sort of the early rollout model for the internet and organizing a volunteer army of helpers to control the military through helpers that were focused on environmental issues. And you can see in the drawings and writings of the First Earth Battalion handbook, the prototype model for the social justice warriors that are being churned out of Berkeley and Stanford today. This article is called "Ken Kesey and the Sexual Mores of Perry Lane." The straight-laced whites, Robin the son of missionaries and Marnie a practicing Quaker, objected to the wild parties. They also disapproved of the drug use that would later develop on the lane, but they particularly disliked the Kesey's liberal sexual attitudes. It was not as if Perry Lane had previously conformed to the conservative sexual mores of the day, far from it, but the Keseys pushed those already extended boundaries a little further. Soon after they arrived, they made it known that they had an open marriage, and it did not take long for them to start exercising their sexual freedom. They befriended a young couple who lived across the street from their cottage. After a party during which Kesey was necking with the woman and his wife Faye with the man, they came back to the lane and each couple paired off to separate houses. So this is the sort of thing that was going on. The line between friend and lover on Perry Lane was often difficult to discern in a social milieu that Jane Burton once described as an incredibly supportive group love affair. So this bohemian part of Stanford on the military area, with the leader Ken Kesey being connected to the MKUltra project. Chloe Scott, she's come in from Long Island and the kind of East Coast New York art scene there. She said everybody was sleeping with everybody. Nudity and sex became part of the social experiment on the lane. So before there was acid tests, there was already social experiments going on. A bunch of these writers from Stanford's creative writing program, Kesey, the prettiest little boy you've ever seen, he's calling himself, and he's Kesey's job appears to be to move the needle and to push things, towards more free love. This is 1960, remember, so the Summer of Love wasn't launched until 1967, and the Grateful Dead wasn't put together until the end of 1965. So very, very early on in this piece, we have this convergence of things. Gregory Bateson, Leo Hollister, Navy, MKUltra related projects, Ken Kesey being brought in, and the delivery of drugs that were part of the MKUltra experiments to this sex, drugs, rock and roll scene, which is being described as a social experiment taking place on the Stanford campus, on the military part of it. Nudity and sex became part of the social experiment on the lane. When a couple of inches of snow fell on the lane briefly during the winter of 1962, which is a pretty rare occurrence in mid-peninsula of the Bay Area, that's for sure, Kesey, Vic and the others quickly scraped up all the snow they could and lined their side of the street with snowmen and snowwomen copulating in Kama Sutra poses. They didn't last very long. You had to live on the street to see it. Even with snow, Kesey would show a little bit of defiance to the norm. Strip poker was not that unusual on the lane, nor was the occasional topless moment or nude sunbathe. So this is some of the origins of the hippie movement going on here. And it's interesting that they call it Bohemian. I mean, first of all, you have the Bohemian Club, Bohemian Grove, and strong links between that organisation and Stanford throughout its history, that's for sure. But you also have Burning Man as a Bohemian thing that Larry Harvey, the founder, uses that word frequently in his speeches about Burning Man. And also he considered the most ideal San Francisco experience you could have was to start out with a brown paper bag lunch sitting on the steps of the Bohemian Club on top of Nob Hill. Before the drugs entered the fray, which tended to lower people's inhibitions even further, things could get pretty loose. After another Hawaiian-style cookout in the summer of 1959 turned into a 3-day marathon party, Kesey emerged from his bedroom early one morning to find at least 5 or 6 couples scattered around his living room floor. Most were just trying to sleep off their hedonistic endeavours, but much to Kesey's voyeuristic delight, he saw that 2 of the couples were engaged in breathless, frantic love-making, impervious to the people around them. Shocking stuff for some locals, but within a few years, nudity would become almost fashionable amongst a certain social set in the region. One of the most talked about occasions involved a Passover celebration in which about 40 naked people marked the traditional Jewish holiday in the living room of Group House, a Menlo Park office complex of psychologists. So this is where you have Myron Stolaroff, again connected to the human potential movement, connected to Gerald Hurd, and he's got the IFAS, the International Foundation for Advanced Study. He's participating with these psychologists, with these experiments, and obviously, 40 people celebrating Passover together. It sort of suggests that was 40 members of the Jewish community. So it's an indication of, I guess, the type of people that were clustering around Perry Lane. So now I want to move on to another one of the Perry Lane crew. And this is what I think is one of the most interesting parts of this story, and where how basically the pranksters are formed first, and then the pranksters form the Dead, and that first of all obviously being the Warlocks playing with the witches on other sides of the room, and when they had to suddenly pick a new name on the behest of Bill Graham to play at the Fillmore. They said the Grateful Dead, and there's different stories about the picking of the name. Obviously, you've heard one from Chip Wood on the last episode of this show. But you have the Beat generation, Kerouac on the Road and Ginsberg, Howe becoming like these defining poets, and they inspired a generation. And you have this whole subculture around the Beats, William S. Burroughs as well. Suspected CIA assassin. And they're promoting the drug culture all around the world, and they are kind of using this Merry Prankster-ish type behavior, this wild, crazy behavior, as a little bit of a cover. Like, don't worry about this guy. He's just a poet. He's a wacky drug taker. He's Allen Ginsberg dancing CIA dope calypso dance. Don't worry about him. And that's not only a very good cover for intelligence operations, but there's a strong pattern of these agents playing the fool so as to be dismissed and not taken seriously, and people to let their guard down and share their confidences. And Aleister Crowley was a great example of that. If you look into the story of his earlier travels, he pretended to just be some mountain climbing rich kid student, trust fund kiddie of his day, and not have any kind of sharp mind or occult knowledge at all. Meanwhile, he's hoovering that stuff up wherever he could go, and actually seeking out secret lodges and repositories, repositories of knowledge, which sounds like secret agent missions to me, even from a young age. And anyway, if you look into the way intelligence operations work, you will find many examples of that sort of play the full thing. And I see that in the Merry Pranksters, and I see that later in the Cacophony Society, which fed into Burning Man, the concept of flash mobs coming out of Burning Man. And now we have these different like SJW scenes today where it's very easy to trigger a group of these kids that have been pre-programmed for the triggering, and they're so used to dealing in an online world where if they don't like someone, they can block them. When they're in the real world and they're confronted with that fight or flight response, they just want to go to their safe space. It's only flight. But back here in 1959, 1960, the youth of today were very different. And so you can see, looking through the lens of history now back to it, that the social engineering operation did pacify and mellow out multiple generations of youth. Did it lead to a drop in violent crime, per 1,000 people? That's scope for a discussion for another day. I don't have the statistics on that to hand. But I want to look at this one link between the Beat generation and this Merry Prankster scene, which is Neil Cassidy. So there's a couple of different versions, one from Ken Kesey and one from Ken Babs. Cassidy just showed up at Perry Lane one day, and not only did he become an immediate part of this bohemian drug-taking, nudity, wife-swapping, swinging scene there, warmly and instantly embraced, but he became then the driver for the Merry Pranksters for the further bus, and immortalised in Kerouac's On the Road, but then immortalised again in the history of the Merry Pranksters. So this is from the Paris Review. Interviewer: Neil Cassidy was amused to the beats and then became one to you as you started writing. When did you first encounter him? Kesey says, it was 1960. He had just finished the 2 years he served in the pen. He showed up at my place on Perry Lane when I was at Stanford. He arrived in a Jeep with a blown transmission, and before I was able to get outside and see what was going on, Cassidy had already stripped the transmission down into big pieces. He was talking a mile a minute and there was a crowd of people around him. He never explained why he was there, then or later. He always thought of these events as though he was being dealt cards on a table by hands greater than ours. But that was one of my earliest impressions of him as I watched him running around, this frenetic, crazed character speaking in a monologue that sounded like Finnegan's Wake, played fast forward. He'd just started to get involved in the drug experiments at the hospital in Menlo Park, as I had. I thought, oh my God, it could lead to this. I realised then that there was a choice. Cassidy had gone down one road. I thought to myself, are you going to go down that road with Burroughs, Ginsberg and Kerouac, at that time still unproven crazies, or are you going to take the safer road that leads to John Updike? Cassidy was a hero to all of us who followed the wild road, the hero who moved us all. So even Kesey, ostensibly the founder of the Merry Pranksters, Neil Cassidy from the Beats as his muse, even he admits he had no idea how come Cassidy just shows up one day and then joins the group, right? And Cassidy himself is saying that, well, he's being dealt cards by a hand greater than ours. So, to me, that's quite a clear, indication that there was somebody behind the scenes manipulating these events. This wasn't all just random, that all of a sudden this guy just shows up. And then later you'd have Dick Alpert, aka Rammed Ass. He showed up as part of this Perry Lane scene. Allen Ginsberg, he cruised on and became a part of it. Randomly mixed in with all these SRI people. And one thing that I should note is that where this area is, in this Perry Lane area in Stanford, it's also very close to the most advanced research area of Stanford, where you had the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, which Stuart Brand was given a tour of in 1962. And you also had what later would become Xerox PARC. And again, Stuart Brand is involved, Doug Engelbart, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs have both shown, the windowing display computer, desktop graphics, and desktop publishing with a mouse, and the transmission of these internet control signals from one computer to another one in a different location remotely in 1968. It's called the mother of all demos, and Stuart Brand put it together coming out of Xerox PARC. So this is where the social experiment was going on, where other experiments, the most advanced technological experiments in the entire world, were going on at Stanford in these days. And much of it classified Defense Department work, much of it being done by SRI International, then known as the Stanford Research Institute, and being funded by the military. And still to this day, that's what's going on there, and the social experiments continue. We have Facebook being caught red-handed, testing people's emotional response to stories they're being fed on their newsfeed, doing like mass-scale experiments on people without their consent. And this is just shades of the sort of mass observation stuff that Jason Horsley has done great research on and talked about being done around the time of World War II in Great Britain. I mean, this is Tavistock stuff, and I certainly consider Stanford, and particularly the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, to be the main US base of the Tavistock operation, which in turn is funded by the top level oligarchs. And Stanford owns Silicon Valley, don't ever forget that. That's why this is really so important to this story, and it's not a coincidence that these counterculture figures such as Timothy Leary, such as John Perry Barlow, were sort of switched over between these worlds to come from the 60s and the Grateful Dead to suddenly pushing virtual reality and personal computers and the internet and cyberspace. They move these people from operation to operation, and that's exactly what appears to have happened with Cassidy, Ginsberg, and Ram Dass, and also with the presence of Eric Trist, Tavistock founder, being there, while his son happens to be on a gap year, and his son's just come in from Paris, where he's been hanging out with all these beats as well. So that's another indication to me of an operation that was ongoing, being moved to Stanford and basically being developed, around this cluster of houses around Perry Lane. And so then we also have the Chateau in Menlo Park with the stuff that was going on there, and Garcia's moved in there October 61. So Jerry Garcia, he's a teenager when he gets out of the army and comes and sort of gets attached onto all this scene. That's Ken Kesey's story of meeting Cassidy, but let's have a look at Babs's story. And Babs has written this story in the form of a poem, KB, a Cassidy poem, P-O-M-E. I don't know if that's a deliberate misspelling. Ever hear of Neil Cassidy, the Beat Generation legend, best friends with Jack Kerouac? On the Road was Jack's book, and Cassidy was the character named Dean Moriarty, the man who bridged time between the Beats, the Pranksters, and the psychedelic revolutionaries. The drug agents weren't impressed. They called him Johnny Potseed. He did 2 years for 2 joints, and when he got out, he drove to Kesey's house on Perry Lane, across the street from the Stanford golf course, talking all the time and never repeating himself once. The rear end went out of his Jeep station wagon. He spent all weekend repairing it while the neighborhood croquet game went on around him, and he enlightened them with mystifying quips. We're fourth-dimensional beings inhabiting a three-dimensional body, living in a two-dimensional world, black and white, good and evil with a touch of grey. So, I mean, these people are fully embracing evil and sin and amorality into their lives. That's part of the drug culture. So, with this bohemian undertone, there is a satanic undertone to all of these operations, and particularly looking at Aldous Huxley being such a major figure in it, and his role with these ISIS Urania cults that he basically had set up prior to World War II across the United States, with a particular focus on the West Coast. So there you have, stories differ again. That's always a sign that, maybe people are misremembering because it was a long time ago, but maybe these are cover stories and people are not actually going from their memory. They're going from the memory of the cover story. But he's saying that the rear end went out of the Jeep. So the transmission is usually where the engine is, which is the front of the car. I don't know. I mean, a Jeep station wagon, maybe somebody can tell me if the design of those things in 1959, 1960, the transmission would have been in the rear. You know, I'm not sure about that. But anyway, and the other part of the story that seems to differ is he's saying that basically the minute this guy got out of jail, he drove to Kesey's house. I mean, how does that come about? You know, just randomly. Just going to randomly go to the heart of the CIA's MKUltra experiments on the Stanford University campus on the military part, and then, you know, take your car to pieces on the lawn until you get accepted into it. Hope you can see that image of Neil Cassidy. These guys were all kind of the movie stars of their day. They were popular and charismatic and photogenic, and you have to, that to me is further indication of, the assigned nature of this, that it wasn't just a few friends randomly got together and it turned out some of them went on to be these incredibly famous and successful literary figures. Like, literally everyone on the bus published at least one book. I mean, when does that normally happen in the story of bands or groups of people getting together and taking a bunch of drugs? That's a red flag or a strange coincidence to the story in itself. But, the characteristics of these people do seem to suggest they were selected and that there was some type of, background they were looking for. And the story that I've run into again and again with this research is these wayward teens getting into trouble, doing something kind of they shouldn't, like John Perry Barlow trying to break into NORAD. And next thing you know, they end up, sort of redirected in their life, going down a path that happens to be, crawling with military intelligence operatives and, plugged directly into what we now know were CIA social engineering experiments. So in the case of Neil Cassidy, he met a guy called Justin Brierley when he was 15. And Brierley took him under his wing and gave him his first homosexual experience. And then that led to Cassidy getting married to a girl that was only 16. And then they went to visit one of Brierley's other victims at Columbia University, a guy called Hal Chase. And Chase was the guy that introduced them to Allen Ginsberg. So I think at the time that Cassidy met Ginsberg, he was 18, bringing his 16-year-old bride into this New York beat scene around Allen Ginsberg. And Ginsberg at the time was also just coming out of the seminary at Columbia University, where he'd studied to be a priest. About Cassidy's death, while the details of his death are almost as mythologized as his life, what is known is that he was found by some railroad tracks in Mexico after mixing beer with barbiturates, possibly at a wedding party. So, mysterious death, body found next to some railroad tracks. Nothing to see here, move along. And then this guy, Justin Brierley, I'd never heard of him before looking into this, but he's quite an interesting character. And he basically, what his thing seemed to be was to meet these, wayward youths who would get into trouble with the law. The common thread amongst them seems to have been they were not just troubled, but quite good looking. And he would then bring them in, seduce them, and then place them into top universities and colleges and set them on a course towards a career. So you could say, well, he was what a kind philanthropist that, he was helping these youths, straighten them out. But that behaviour is known as grooming, and it's really of quite concern that not only did Cassidy come out of this, and he may have also had an affair with Jack Kerouac. We'll get to that in a second. But another one of the proteges of Justin Brierley was Norman Ralph Augustine, who was the CEO of Lockheed Martin. So, and this is coming out of Denver, Colorado, where there's all kinds of this secret military stuff and NORAD stuff in Colorado. And remember, we have from Chip's story that the entire origins of the Grateful Dead did come out of Colorado Springs. With him, Bob Weir, and John Perry Barlow. So Justin Brierley was also connected to Winston Churchill, who was a Freemason and a Druid, and he was invited by Churchill to be an advisor during the Second World War. So 1941, Brierley met Neil Cassidy, then a 15-year-old juvenile delinquent who'd become a significant influence on the beat writers and a countercultural icon in his own right. Impressed by Cassidy's intelligence, Brierley took an active role in his life over the next few years, helping admit him to high school, encouraging and supervising his reading, and finding employment for him. Cassidy continued his criminal activities, however, and was repeatedly arrested from 42 to 44. On at least one of these occasions, he was released by law enforcement into Briley's safekeeping. Let me show you a picture of this guy. I mean, I don't want to be too judgmental, but I think the guy looks like a pedo to me. And, you know, well, regardless of what I think, I mean, the behaviour is without exception that I've identified at least 4 children that he put through this. Briley, apparently a closeted homosexual, is also believed to have been responsible for Cassidy's first homosexual experience. Cassidy was introduced in 1946 to future Beat Generation literary icons Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg by another Briley protege, Hal Chase, who Briley had helped place at Columbia University. Kerouac in turn met Briley in 1947 during a trip to see Cassidy in Denver and established a friendship with him. Briley wrote an article about Kerouac's first novel in the Denver Post, organised a book signing for him. And then in the second novel, On the Road, Briley accordingly had a major role in the early manuscripts because it was, you know, a loosely fictionalized version of Kerouac's friendship with Cassidy. So Briley had a major role, which provided important context for Cassidy's depiction. Kerouac also took the opportunity to satirize him at length, and in fear of a libel suit from Briley, considered one of the few respectable figures in the book, Kerouac substantially trimmed his depiction. Briley appears in the final published novel only in brief passages as the comical minor character Denver D. Doll. So, yeah, this guy is intimately tied to the entire Beat generation. You know, he's someone that is bringing all of these people together. This one saying Briley was impressed by Neil Cassidy's high IQ of 132, arranged for him to be admitted into high school in Denver, and then he introduced him to Kerouac and Ginsberg. After attending Columbia University, Briley helped form a talent agency in New York. So, yeah, this guy grooming these teenage kids for life as counterculture and MKUltra ambassadors had a talent agency in New York. Isn't that interesting? He returned to Denver to practice law, played a major role in establishing the Central City, Colorado Opera Festival, which he was executive manager from 1937 to 1948. So during World War II, this guy's putting on operas. And then, you know, in between the operas, he goes to England at the invitation of Winston Churchill as a consultant on the evacuation of children from urban to rural areas. So this child groomer is pulling these kids out of the city and away on a farmland in conjunction with Winston Churchill. I mean, how does this come about? And then he was also making an extensive tour of the British Isles to make a special study of the youth of England, and he'll be an unofficial observer for 20th Century Fox. So he's got a talent agency, and he's scouting talent amongst the youth, and then he's grooming the talent to go into places like Columbia University and to go on to get jobs like to be the CEO of Lockheed Martin. Now, Briley was also the psychologist for this radio and then TV series of the 1940s and 50s called Quiz Kids, where they basically, you know, went around the country looking for the smartest children in the United States. So, again, identifying and then presumably grooming talent. Briley himself was the protege of another person very involved with wayward youth, Benjamin Barr Lindsay, and he's basically considered the creator of the juvenile court. Here's a photo of him in 1902. He was known as the Little Judge. He was apparently quite a frail and sickly man. He made his bench smaller than the regular judge's bench to be more down on the height of the children. He would not always wear the formal judge's robes, preferring more casual clothing to look a bit more like the children, and then he would quite often resolve cases with private meetings in the judge's chambers. So you be the judge if this little man with his moustache and everything looks like a pedophile to you or not. I'll keep my opinion on that one to myself. I think you can probably guess it. During World War I, Benjamin Barr Lindsay worked in Europe for the relief of war orphans from 1915 to 1918 as part of the Henry Ford peace mission. So they're basically going into war zones, looking for orphans, rounding them up and bringing them back to the United States, presumably. He's recognised as the founder of the US juvenile court system. He advocated for laws that recognise juveniles differently from adults, not as criminals, but as misguided youth in need of education and reform. So this was the mentor for Justin Briley. Briley worked directly for Lindsay. and we'll get to some of that relationship in a second. He also wrote legislation that held parents accountable for juvenile delinquency. So that, that would give a lot of leverage over the parents to someone like Justin Briley, who's saying, look, I know this kid's got in trouble with the law again, but just release him to my care. And if the parents don't want to go along with it, well, then they could be held responsible for the delinquency of the kids. So very, very interesting kind of angle to it there. Lindsay was Denver's juvenile court judge from 1907 to 1927, when he was ousted from the bench in a fierce political battle with the Ku Klux Klan. The judge's attitude towards youthful criminality was also apparent in his courtroom. The atmosphere was one of ease and informality. Lindsay firmly believed that faith, trust, empathy, and kindness were the proper methods of dealing with all but the most incorrigible of youthful offenders. He lowered the court bench and discarded judicial attire. He spoke the language of the boys. Most of his work was done informally in chambers. He was willing to be fair, open, and honest, and he dealt with those appearing before him with kindness and imagination. He liberally suspended the criminal law through use of the probation system, and he could remember only 5 cases out of hundreds in which young offenders put on their honour had broken it. He knew most of his probationers' names and held regular informal Saturday morning sessions during which he spoke to them morally but kindly. He went to movies and sports events with his boys. So does that sound like another groomer to you? I mean, his theory was encapsulated as no justice without love. And it's based on the belief that most offenders were more likely to be reformed by being given a chance to live under unobstructive supervision with society than by being forced to live exclusively with convicted criminals. The system worked in that the youth of the Denver area came to confide in him and would have even come to him on their own, convinced that his hands they would find a square deal. So you can see what's going on here. The judge's challenge to traditional definitions of sexual morality. Lindsay advocated the free dissemination of contraceptive information and materials. He became notorious for his book, Companionate Marriage. So a companionate marriage was a legal marriage dissolvable by mutual consent and at least temporarily childish. So it now sounds archaic, but basically he came up with a way that people could hook up without being married in the traditional sense of the church and having to be for life. And that's what he was pushing. He was pushing women should use contraceptives and there should be free love. So we could see this idea coming from this guy who loved to be surrounded by the youth in his chambers in private meetings, writing books about how to be promiscuous and stuff like that. And he was one of the earliest advocates for sex education. He has then groomed this guy, Justin Briley, who has gone on to groom Norman Augustine, Lockheed Martin's CEO, Hal Chase, Jack Kerouac, Neil Cassidy. Robert Leland Johnson was another one of the boys groomed by Briley, that he called his proteges. He went on to go to Yale. You tell me if you think that's a good-looking guy or not. He sort of, there does seem to be a bit of a type that this guy Briley was into. He seemed to like quite masculine-looking guys. And Robert Johnson went on to write a book, Yale Sophomore, an epic novel of youthful ambition, fulfillment, and despair. He was a senior in Denver, Colorado, had to register for the draft because of the Korean conflict. He joined the Air Force ROTC, passed the deferment test. Justin Briley, my college counselor at East High School, on notification by telegram from Yale of the largest scholarship ever awarded, remarked casually to me, "There's something about you. You're different, and that is good. Remember that anyone who does anything has enemies and those who talk about him. So get ready. You have great expectations." He then added, "Always use your full name, and when you shake hands, do so firmly." Dean Norman Buck would later write that I set an all-around record never before achieved at Yale. So again, this sounds to me like someone that's grooming young men, teaching them, how to dress, how to shake hands, how to succeed at Yale, placing them into Yale. And then just like a tiny minor aside, I found a common ancestor between George Eastman and Robert Leland Johnson. George Eastman, of course, the founder of Eastman Kodak, tied up to Linda Eastman, married Paul McCartney, the whole Paul Fall thing. And Eastman Kodak was also one of the clients of Arcturus Project, which was Jim Channon's consulting company. One story of the origins of the Grateful Dead name, 1965. Since then, the search for that magic has been as important for the Dead as music. Music for the Dead has to capture that magic. In the late days of the acid test, they heard of another band called the Warlocks, so they decided they'd have to change the name. It was a grey, stormy, blowy day in old Palo Alto. I don't know if that means they were doing a ton of blow or what. We were hanging out at Phil's house smoking DMT. We'd just found out there was another band called the Warlocks, so we couldn't use that name. We were trying to figure out names, and we came out with about 1 million of them, and none of them quite got it. We decided to thumb through the Oxford Dictionary, so Jerry got up and walked over and spun the dictionary, put his finger in it, and it came out Grateful Dead. It's an ethnological term. It has to do with a guy named Childs who went around and catalogued a lot of folk ballads from Northern Ireland and Scotland back before the turn of the century. There was a whole section that he did on what were the Grateful Dead ballads, the Grateful Dead ballads being visitations and stuff like that, generally having to do with people that had died and come back and been kind of glad. That's what Bob Weir says about the story. And interesting that he's talking about visitations with Chip's revelation that he was from this sort of Mary Baker Eddy speaking in tongues kind of religious background, and that's indeed what Chip had hypnotised him with. There's the idea that this was a visitation from a spirit giving him this idea of the Grateful Dead. So anyway, there's another story. And then Garcia, the classic story is the one where somebody dies but there's some dishonour connected with the death, so they can't really rest until this matter is settled, and then when it's settled, that puts them in the category of being Grateful Dead. It's just what it sounds like, Grateful Dead. So again, there's a lot of different stories, and it's something so profound and significant. Why weren't there witnesses to that? Why aren't there two witnesses with the same story about how it was formulated? So to me, looking at the body of evidence so far that I've presented, and I admit that much of this is circumstantial. Like, my own father was in the military. That doesn't make me an agent of the military. So there's a point where you count these coincidences, and coincidences happen. I totally accept that. And you have to say, well, confirmation bias would say that you're just looking for things that aren't there. But the opposite of that is when you're just looking into these things and you keep finding the same pattern again and again and again. Military parents, Lockheed Martin parents, wayward youth, got involved when they were 16 in this drug culture, went on to huge success. Just keep finding it again and again and again. And so out of those connections, I think, to me, that how else can you explain that this happened? Occam's razor, the simplest possibility is the most likely to be true. And how did all these people come together? Just like how did all these bands come together in Laurel Canyon and underneath the USAF laboratory, and suddenly this thing got launched, and it was all people connected to the MKUltra project, and we're just supposed to say that's a coincidence? Well, that isn't the simplest explanation. To me, that's a ridiculous explanation. And more likely that the reason all of these people connected to these projects came together and did these projects is they were part of these projects and they were recruited into these projects. So I hope that I've presented a pretty, I've tried to be as brief as I can, even though I know this is long, but I've tried to present, at least some of the information that I've found that I think is most noteworthy in my study into who these people are. And so it'll be good to get Chip on, and there's some discrepancies with different versions of the origin story, and then there's also the time frame between Weir going back to Palo Alto at the end of 1963, meeting Garcia and joining his jug band, and then becoming the Warlocks, and then becoming the Grateful Dead. There's a span of time going on, but as you can see, there in that time there was other stuff going on related to these projects, both MKUltra and the social engineering, social experiment project being developed at Stanford, with all the psychologists getting naked at Passover, that then went on to become the acid tests, the Trips Festival, the Summer of Love, and then the whole culture of the world. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you later.